Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our third and final panel. This one, as you probably know, is entitled Diaspora and Cosmopolitanism. Right now, as will be apparent in the presentations by the speakers, I believe, our two panelists, right, of which there are only two of us, okay, will be speaking closely to this very theme. Okay, and both of them will begin in the context of colonial Southeast Asia. Now, we did say something, for those who are listening in, we did say this is a very coherent panel. There are various reasons. One, okay, apart from using the same background for their PPTs, they're both historians, right? So historians like to use that particular background, so I come to understand, okay? And number two, both papers today, both presentations today, okay, are in a way little sneak previews into a slither of their upcoming books. So there's something bigger, that we can all look forward to their books. And I will, say a little bit, about the little that I know, okay, about what each of them, be doing. Right. Our first speaker will be Seng and the second speaker will be Effendy, Mohamed Effendy, Abdul Hamid. Okay. But I shall introduce the second speaker first, for obvious reasons, right? Since we're gonna, start off with Guo-Quan later. Okay, so now Dr. Effendy is a lecturer with the Department of Southeast Asia Studies here at NUS. Okay, now I mentioned a book that he's writing on, from which this talk is, a bit of, right? It examines the role of Bugis men of martial arts skills in the development of Johor Riau Lingga Empire from the 17th to the 19th centuries. Now, his work will include interviews from the descendants of such warriors that are still alive in Johor, Riau, and Singapore today, okay? Which makes it really quite urgent and very important, that he's, actually, capturing the stories, the memories, yeah, and the sort of practices, that still survives to today. Okay. Now, in my conversations with Effendy, I had this, suspicion that he probably was himself, an exponent of Silat. Yeah. Reluctantly, he admitted yes, he was. He's into Silat. Okay, but also Kendo, right? Although he wants me to qualify that he's a retired one. I don't know what that means, but but anyway, yeah. So that explains his positionality, being able to get into this particular piece of research itself, right? Now, oh yeah, I know. In saying that he's retired, he said he's not able to kill a Pontianak. You know a Pontianak, right? Yeah, so you can depend on him for that. Okay. Now, in his talk, Effendy will be addressing a part of Singapore's history that is, in fact, overlooked. Yeah, the role of men of prowess, okay, as he calls them elsewhere. These men, highly skilled in the martial arts, from parts of Indonesia, or what we think of as Indonesia today, have traveled and settled here in Singapore. Okay, what roles do they play in our history? How did British colonialism and the advent of the modern state altered their histories? Now, these are kind of questions and more, that we'll be hearing from Effendy later. Okay, so there's a lot, to look forward to. Now, I shall now turn to our first speaker, right? Seng Chen. I got it right this time. Okay, right. He is an assistant professor, also historian in, obviously, the Department of History. Okay. Now, broadly, his interests are with the patterns of Chinese trade and migration, right, as well as with overseas Chinese social and political formations in Southeast, mostly in the context of the history of capitalism, right? So there's a very rich area, that he's looking into. Now, his talk today is also based, on a chapter in his book manuscript. Okay? And his book manuscript is entitled, his upcoming book is entitled Intimate Strangers. I love that title. Gender and Chinese Moral Borders in Colonial Indonesia, right? As he described in his abstract, it deals with the formation of an ethnic minority identity under Dutch colonial rule in Indonesia to intersecting discourses of race, gender, and civilizing legal reforms. Right now, Seng's paper for us today is concerned with understanding the relative autonomy enjoyed by Peranakan Chinese women in the context of colonial Java in Indonesia. And in particular, it traces their relative autonomy to its grounding in a way that the Confucian marriage system was creolized by local Islamic divorce norms. Right? So it reminds us, of the very first panel, that kind of link. Yeah. Reading Seng's abstract for the talk, I am reminded of the significance of women's capacity to end marriages that they do not wish to remain in. Thank you for that. Right. So the title of his talk, Women Initiated Divorce and the Making of a Chinese Patriarchy in Colonial Java. Portion, please take over.
Thanks, Ivan. Can I also begin by thanking the organizers of the Singapore Research Nexus for inviting me. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Right, so Ivan has introduced the talk, right? So let me just dive into it. As is mentioned, right, it comes out of my book manuscript, Intimate Strangers, Gender and Chinese Moral Borders. Today's talk in colonial Indonesia. So today's talk is based on chapter 3, right, in a broader arch of an argument in which, I'm trying to make an intervention in several fields, field of colonial studies in Southeast Asia, and the field of the history of Chinese overseas, right? And the broader argument is to problematize our received understandings of the formation of, modern Chinese Indonesian or ethnic Chinese identity, right, through the lenses of gender, desire, and sexuality. Okay, and in this chapter, I deal with the question of divorce, right, and what this social fact and the patterns that it reveals says about Chinese moral womanhood in 19th century colonial Java. So first, who were the Peranakan Chinese, or the Creole Chinese, right? To give you the demographic context, quite different from the Strait settlements of Singapore, Malacca, and Penang that we here in Singapore are more familiar with, right? So if you just look at the Chinese population numbers on Java across the 19th century, 19th and early 20th century, right? It's quite significant that by and large, they had gender balance, right? Female to male ratio was, so if you look at the female to male ratio, right, with increasing Chinese male migration, right, from the 1870s onwards, and then from, let's say, the 1910s and 20s, Chinese women began to leave China, right? So that began to upset the gender balance of the 19th century. But by and large, it's remarkable, right, that in the 1860s and the 1880s, right, there was only an excess of, let's say, 12 to 15%, right, of men to women. And the contrasting figure for the Strait settlements would be 90% to 10%, right? This only or men outnumbered women by more than 10 times, right? Now, our understanding of Peranakan Chinese womanhood is mostly based on ethnographic and cultural studies from early 20th century sources, right? So in one of the seminal studies by Margaret Balkett-Sick, for instance, right, it's mostly based on observations in the early 20th century and projected backwards, right, to the 19th century. And typically the argument has been that, right, it's being moderated by Javanese culture, right? And by Javanese culture, scholars mostly refer to this notion of the bilateral kinship system, right? That is that inheritance or their residential pattern, right, can go both down the daughters as well as the son's line. So this is quite different from the patrilineal system of the Chinese, right? So Here I quote Bauket Sik, right? The concept was accepted in Peranakan Chinese society, right? So typically it's being argued here, softened by Javanese tradition, right? So my point of contention here is Islam, or the influence of Islam, right, is not often mentioned or considered. So in this chapter, I'm essentially arguing that, right, through divorce, we actually both get a sense of Chinese women's moral agency, right, as well as how they negotiated that moral freedom, right, with the patriarchal leaders of the community. So the broad outlines of Chinese patriarchal leadership in colonial urban Java, but in of Batavia, or today's Jakarta in particular, right? So there's a long history of that going back to the Dutch East India Company days, right? So for close to 200 years, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, right, the Dutch East India Company, required these merchant community leaders, right, appointed by the Dutch, for being loyal to them, right, being trustworthy, wealthy merchant leaders, to register marriages, right? And this system lasted all the way in Batavia until it was replaced by the civil marriage law in 1919. There were some modifications in the 19th century, right, with the introduction of the Indies Constitution, the civil code coming from Napoleonic France to the Netherlands, and then, right, transposed to the Dutch East Indies, right, forced the Dutch in the Indies to rethink, right, the system of indirect rule, right, and the legal system. But by and large, the system remained in place, right? So in the 19th century, these merchant leaders, right, were reconstituted as advisors of the laws and religions of their respective nation, right? And in my book, right, I show how, in another chapter, I show how in the later part of the 19th century in particular, right, what constitutes Chinese law, right, became a subject of Dutch sinology, right? And it began to influence women's property rights in the civil courts. But in this chapter, I deal with divorce, right? And divorce, right, interestingly, if you look at the span or the scope of, right, authority of the capitans, right, the 19th century leading to the early 20th century saw progressive steps in, right, the reduction of their power, right? And this is one aspect that, right, in the existing literature, let's say by James Rush or by Mona Lohanda, right, it tends to be about the capitans' public or entrepreneurial roles in colonial Javanese society, right? But this aspect hasn't really been looked at beyond the first step taken by Chen Menghong, right, in the Dutch language work, the Chinese community of Batavia, 1843 to 1865. So across the 19th century, right, the Dutch took away their powers, right? Before 1855, if they had, if Chinese had commercial disputes below a certain sum of money, they went to the capitans, right, not to the Dutch courts. Inheritance, right, the Dutch began to intervene, especially on the issue of daughters' inheritance, right? So they were constitutionally bound to consult the capitans, right? But more and more, what happened from 1855 onwards, sinologists were coming in with Confucian texts, right? The Li Ji, the 4 books, to argue that the Chinese are way more patrilineal than these Crow Chinese are practicing, their kinship in Java, right? And finally, the final step, right, was to take away their power to register marriages and, interestingly, arbitrate divorce pleas, right? So this is something we over here, right, as descendants of the Strait settlements, right, it's unheard of, right? The British never intervened in Chinese marriage and divorce law, right? They only intervened in inheritance, right? There was an attempt in the 1920s, right, to consult the Chinese if they wanted to introduce a codified marriage law or even a registry, right? It was led by a committee, Chinese marriage committee headed by Song Ong-xiang, right? But the overwhelming response, right, from the Chinese community in the 3 settlements was no, right? Please don't touch marriage, right? This is our own matter. So, what exactly were the procedures and patterns, right? The first interesting thing to note is that divorce as a concept, right? Civil divorce, amicable divorce, was simply unknown in contemporary late imperial Chinese custom, right? Or in Chinese law, right? So this is Qing Dynasty law. In Janet Theis's study, right? The only way by which, you know, the parents of daughters, right, who had problems, right, in their new family, right, was in murder cases, right, when they would go to the Yamen, the magistrate, to sue for murder, right. So it was radically new to, right, the Chinese community outside of China. If you look closer at the procedures, right, I'm arguing that, right, there was a certain form of procedural equalization, right? And I'm not trying to sort of trivialize the experience of, right, filing for divorce, right? But if you just compare what it meant for a woman who's mostly been, right, deserted, trying to gain his freedom, right? The first step is always to just go to these institutes, right? In the sort of Islamic Javanese case, it was to go to a mosque, right? In the veranda of the mosque, where the penghulu holds court, right? That's where you file for a divorce, right? And 19th century observers observe it's fairly, relatively convenient, right? In terms of the bureaucratic procedure, right? They were almost treating it as a bureaucratic procedure in what is mostly known as the kulak, right? The kulak form of female-initiated divorce. So this was widely observed by Southeast Asian Muslim women. The picture at the top shows the frontage of the Guo-Quan. Of course, this is from the early 20th century, right? So its power had declined. But one could also imagine, right? The first step for the women was always, you know, I have to go and see these patriarchs, file my plea, right? And then try to get my freedom. So what I've studied is 738 cases, right? That's been recorded in the very famous Batavia Chinese Council minutes, right? They've been preserved, transported to Leiden and preserved, digitized, edited, published, annotated, right, by scholars in the Netherlands and in Xiamen, right? Chen Menghong has taken the first step, as I mentioned earlier, right? But her argument of the mid-19th century Chinese society is from her book. They look very Chinese, right? Very patriarchal. So I'm arguing that it's from the divorce case that you can see, right, where the creolization is happening, right? So the broad facts, the broad patterns: crude divorce rate by decade, right? It ranged from 2 to 10%, right, in every decade, from the 1820s to the 1890s, peaking in the 1870s at 10%. That is to say, for every 10 marriages that were registered, right, one ended in divorce, right? This may seem like nothing in our contemporary eyes, right? But recall that this is a time when divorce in both Christian Europe and Confucian China was just simply impossible, right? The UK was one of the first European nations to have divorce, right? In legalized divorce in the 1870s, right? And even then, for the first few decades, divorce rate was 0.01, around there, right? So to have 10% divorce rate, right, was really significant for 19th century. The other interesting pattern is that between 60 to 80% of divorce suits were filed by women, right? So again, conversely, between 40 and 20%, right, were filed by men. Again, from contemporary studies, it's not surprising, right? It's a universal fact that when marriages fail, men drag their feet, right? And women tend to be the ones who, right, initiate divorce, right? But again, right, this is fairly significant for the patriarchal, or what we know is a patriarchal Chinese society, right, of colonial Java. So I'm not going to talk about what men say in a divorce pleas, right? It's fairly conventional. They expect their wives to be at home, right? Some women were roaming the streets, were not coming home, right? So it tend to revolve around that kind of problems. And in this chapter, I've mostly dealt with the 60 to 80% of divorce suits, right? And the overwhelming majority were approved, right? Were approved. So let me give you an example, right? Let me walk you through the case. What happens, or how does a woman file for divorce, right? This case comes from 1874 in July, right? From stage 1 to 2. Cheng Chunyo was 31, right? Married for 13 years, has a 13-year-old son. So the first thing you do is you go to the Chinese council, you go to a pre-trial when two capitans, right, two officers were on duty, right? So she filed for divorce, right, from Lau Bun Tek. So the two officers recorded her plea, right? And you can see a certain, right, negotiating of responsibility in a Confucian framing here, right? So my husband has been away from home for the past 6 to 7 years. He married a concubine, ignored me, did not provide half a cent, right? Sometimes comes home for less than a month, maybe gone again, right? I've tolerated all this up to now, dependent on my father. Recently, son fell ill, right? And this is the interesting part, right? I got someone to inform him he didn't care. His conscience is liang, right? The new Confucian value has never been more lacking in humanity, right? So she files a plea. The trial is held only when the husband comes. So you can imagine some women having to, wait for ages, right? So I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to be a bit faster, right? So essentially, the husband says no, right? I will be better to her, right? I'll provide for her, but I'm not going to agree to divorce. And when that happens, right, the capitans actually investigate, right, how true it is. Almost 90% of the time, right, it turns out to be false. The woman, the man cannot support the family, right, and the capitans grant the divorce. In this case, they actually check with the employer, right, and it turns out, right, he's not regularly employed. He still doesn't agree, right? So the capitans cannot grant a divorce if the husband doesn't agree, right? In this case, it was raised to the Dutch resident, is overruled, and the divorce was approved 2 weeks later. So this tends to be, right, the procedure women had to undergo. As I mentioned earlier, there's no customary legal precedent for divorce in Chinese culture. At that time, there was also, no institutional legal precedent from Europe, right? When I first encountered these cases, it seemed like every divorce case had its own story, right? But by and large, I've grouped them into these 5 causes, right? Desertion, so for material reasons, abuse, physical abuse, and interestingly, right, jealousy, when the women accuse the husband of having a concubine outside, right? And this is significant given that in customary law, right, the Chinese were polygamous. Eviction, right, when they were evicted from the family, and then a very sort of traditional Chinese kind of tension between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, right? So these across the century, right, these tends to be the 5 reasons with minor fluctuations over the decades. So to conclude, right, what do they tell us about Creole Chinese women's moral agency in the 19th century? Right, so I'm arguing in this chapter that, right, the influence of Islamic legal norms, right, was more important, right, than the previous scholarship has acknowledged. And most of all, right, I'm arguing here that the shape of the Chinese Capitan patriarchy, right, was actually co-negotiated through women's moral and material expectations of their men, right? And in this case, with no precedent from China or Europe, right? And mostly borrowing from the local context, right? It was a Capitan, pragmatic form of invented, right? Creole-Chinese divorce law, so fairly autonomous for women. And finally, so this is the ironic point, right? The Capitans themselves were well known to be polygamous, right? But they admitted polygamy, or rather, it's not so much polygamy, but jealousy, right? Jealousy of the men having a concubine outside, right? As a cause. So if women were to file that, right? So you're the primary wife, you're unhappy with that, yes, you get your divorce, right? So that's the interesting irony. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Guo-Quan, for that exciting paper. We'll now move on to Effendy's paper. Right, Effendy's paper is entitled "Men of Martial Skills in Singapore: Insights to the Social and Cultural Transformation of a Diasporic Community." Effendy, all yours.
Thank you very much. If I may share the screen here. Okay, and then we should begin from the beginning. Okay, so thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to share with me what I have been researching so far. And I have to tell you immediately that this project of mine, current project of mine, began with a very deep yearning to understand the development of the Singapore Malay community. That yearning has been there for quite a while, all right? So reading through the various literature that has informed us about the development of the Singapore Malay community, there are some works which are very important and useful to me. For example, Lili Zubaida Rahim's work that tries to understand the Singapore Malay community from the perspective of underdevelopment. Then, of course, there's the Khairuddin Al-Junaid's perspective to understand the community from the perspective of the Nadra tragedy. All right, these are important works because it allows me to think about alternative perspectives to understand the community a little bit better. And the site of analysis that I have pursued so far was to understand the role that Silat families, Malay martial art families in Singapore, and what do they have in terms of historical knowledge to allow me to answer this question that I've asked for a very long time about the development of the Singapore Malay community. And I was not disappointed. What I've learned so far was quite literally mind-blowing. All right, so let me begin with this presentation. Now, this deep yearning to understand the Singapore Malay community was really, it led to this project, all right, which was sponsored by the National Heritage Board. And that project went on from 2018 to 2020, just recently concluded. And it culminated with interviews with 29 Silat families in Singapore and 18 Sulawesi Silat families, right? Sulawesi, Indonesia, Bugis and Makassar groups. Why this direction to Sulawesi? It began from interviews with these Silat families in Singapore. Most of them have very strong connections to Sulawesi, all right? And I tell you later on. In fact, I tell you now, right? There has been a very long history of connections that Singapore has, surprisingly, with Sulawesi in terms of pre-colonial relationship. And this ties in, all right, to a very strong historical relationship of migration and trade between Singapore and Sulawesi in the pre-colonial past, all right? And this is something which blew my mind away, that a lot of these families still retain the stories, histories of their founders when they came to Singapore about their origin and activity. So all these became very much incredible subject matter for me to work with, for me to write the book, all right, which is about the Singapore Malay community, but from a historical perspective, all right. It is an insight to the social and cultural transformation of the community in many ways. Now, this approach was inspired by I have a lot of intellectual debt, so I have to mention Leonard Andaya's work, 1981, old work, but that is a very important work to me because he was the one that pinpointed to the escape and integration of Bugis princes into the Malay world in the 17th to 18th century. So this is very important work. With that, right, it leads to, it dovetailed with my previous research on the charm of Vietnam and how the destruction of martial hierarchies that the Cham once had, that included the Pandong Jabul or generals, Halo Bilau and Buol or soldiers, was the primary factor that led to the weakening of the Nagara or the kingdom. All right. Then this again was triggered. I was again triggered, inspired by Mary Turnbull, Winstedt's, and Haji Buyong Adil's work, which tries to understand Singapore's and the Malay history, of course, but it's a view from above. All right, and these views, these works must be complemented, I thought, by a view from below. And lastly, the inspirations really came from John Meigsix and Peter Boschberg's works that shows that it is actually possible to reconstruct the 15th and 17th century past from archaeological and Iberian sources. All right, but again, local perspectives cannot be ignored. So where, or rather, how do I do this? I do this, them to complement their knowledge with interviews, with contextualizing their interviews with very good sources from the colonial archives and pre-colonial materials as well. But the work, the material that really triggered a lot of these developments that I mentioned earlier was this 1960 article by Andrew Fung, written in the Straits Times. All right, this short article, very, very succinct, but it contains very unexpected information about Pulau Tekukor, which is located in the middle of St. John's Island and Sentosa. This small island was very intriguing because what Andrew Fung wrote about was that this island was once used as the arena of a duel to the death between Malay and Bugis fighters. Now, this is something very interesting because, you know, the islands, the southern islands of Singapore was, in fact, if you look at in that way, were actually battlefields between two disparate communities, the Bugis and Malays. So this was the article that made me interrogate more into the possibility of using memories from, or historical memories from Silat families to speak back to the archive, to reconstruct a whole new direction to understand Singapore Malay history on Singapore itself. Now, these photos are taken by Dr. Hamzah Muzaini, all right? He's the man for the Southern Islands project. So I asked him for photos and he emailed me a few very important ones. So when you look at this particular island, it is a very interesting place because it is a natural arena. At the corner of the island is actually a space, all right? And that space is covered by very high cliffs, so you can't really escape from it. But this island really triggered two essential questions for which to model my current book on, which is this. What was the role of men of martial skills from the Malay Indonesian world in Singapore? All right. And secondly, what was the impact of the British on these men? And how do they transform in the era of the modern state in Singapore? This is something which is very important, all right? Because when I tried to answer these two questions, I came across answers. And these three answers that I have created for this presentation are going to be, explored further around. But let me go on with trying to explain to you guys about, these three insights that I've gathered from the project so far. First, I will explore men of martial skills, all right? According to a lot of the historical memories of the Silat families were very crucial to the Johor Riau Lingga Empire, which existed during the 17th and 19th centuries, before the Treaty of 1819 and the separation of these worlds in the 1824 Anglo-Dutch Treaty. And I also discovered that, based on this project, right, interviewing Silat families of Singapore, is that really they do tell a very sad story of what happens to the ruler of Singapore, all right, Sultan Hussein and his son, Sultan Ali. What happens when they were weakened? And what happened to the men of martial skills that aided and supported them? Now, this is an insight which, well, I don't think has ever appeared in any sort of literature, but this sort of knowledge are preserved by a lot of families in Singapore. And thirdly is this, all right? Surprisingly enough, when I interrogated more of this, of such knowledge, it is very apparent to me that the development of modern Singapore Malay identity also includes the disciplining of Malay martial art groups in the 1960s to 70s. This is a very interesting aspect to explain how and what is the Malay community in Singapore today now, all right, in their various stages of development. But let me explore the first aspect first, all right? Men of martial skills were crucial to the Johor Riau Lingga Empire from the 17th to 19th centuries. Now, this is one chapter of the book that I'm doing it right now. And let me shortcut through the essential aspects of this. Bugis princes arrived in the Malay world meaning Johor, Indragiri, Siak, and Riau and Lingga. There were attempts to engage with the rulers of these areas, but some succeeded, some didn't. The ones that succeeded in being integrated into the Malay Kerajaan or kingdoms were the ones in Johor. All right, why? Because in 1699, there was the assassination of a Johor ruler, and the Bugis were asked, right? These Bugis princes were asked to participate in the warfare that happened then. The success of the Bugis in repelling the ruler of Siak allowed them to engage in this alliance that culminated in the Persetiaan Marhum Sungai Baru, Oath of Sungai Baru, in October 1722. This was the period of time for which it leads to the entanglement of the Bugis into Malay affairs, Malay political and military affairs, and the development of dual systems, the Bugis system and the Malay system of rule in a Kerajaan. And this leads to a lot of problems down the line. Now, it also led to Bugis martial systems to be hybridized with the already present systems in the Malay world. Now, this has led to very interesting developments because, Malay warfare started to become much more violent. This is something which I'm trying to explore a bit more. It really has to do how the Bugis fight. They do not care about aesthetics. The Bugis martial system really is about taking you out very quickly and most violently, because the spectacle of violence really makes you do not want to engage the attacker, right? It is a very practical way to stop the other from attacking you if the other is afraid of you, all right? So this is the essence of Bugis martial art systems. Very violent, very effective. Now, what I've discovered so far was the central role of this powerful entity called the Solewatang. Now, this is one of the most important men for the Bugis princes in the Malay world. He was the organizer, he was the fighter, and he is highly adept at warfare, organization of warfare, and he is the protector of Bugis rulers and their Bugis Malay descendants. And one of the things that I found in the sources was that the Solewatang's Osong, or war oath, done before battle, they always do this before the battle, really terrified the Malays, all right? So the Solewatang was an essential element that break Malay morale, Malay fighters' morale. And this was recorded in the Pahang Civil War in 1857 and 1863. And surprisingly enough, the Temenggung of Singapore had the Solewatang. The Temenggung of Singapore was a Bugis descent. All right, so he was aided by a Solewatang who engaged, who did his fighting for him. So this is something which I found most amazing, but the more amazing fact that I found was that we still have Solewatang descendants in Singapore. At least one family has preserved the silat techniques of the Solewatang, and Mr. Faizal Nordin right now is the direct descendant of the Solewatang of Singapore. All right, and he was taught this art, the silat art, in the 1980s at Pasir Panjang, which is very near NUS. All right, his village was there. And this is very crucial to the preservation of his identity, language, and even knowledge of Bugis Adat. Right? And this is something which, is a part of the chapter of the book. And what I found so far about the Selewatang in Johor and Singapore was that there was a letter written to the Selewatang by Farquhar himself, yet to be translated. I would love to understand this letter, what was being said by Farquhar to the Selewatang of Singapore, all right? Perhaps they will give insights about the system that existed in Singapore before the British arrived. Because Singapore was part of the Johor Empire, and it is definitely under some sort of leadership. The Selewatang of Singapore was that leader. And I'm still interrogating a bit more from the British archives about, who exactly is this Selewatang. But what I found so far is indeed very interesting, because the Selewatang also helped out Sultan Ali in Johor as a tax collector. But eventually, this Selewatang rebelled against Sultan Ali because he didn't pay this guy enough. All right. So, but that's part of the chapter, and also part of a journal article that's still under review. The second thing I want to talk about is this, all right? The new information that I derived from interviews with Silat families about the impact of weakened authority of the traditional ruler in Singapore. Now, when you talk to these families, I found that, it's quite amazing, because looking at the history of the founders when they came to Singapore, is that, a lot of them arrived in a kingless society. And this led to a transformation of their Silat skills to focus more on cultural and social entertainment, because they are no more part of the royal court. This was the traditional employer of men of martial skills. It was the Kerajaan itself. But there is no Kerajaan in Singapore. So they became entertainers, so on and so forth. And this led to very interesting developments, all right? Because they focused their skills to entertain and to perform these skills for cultural reasons. They actually preserved their skills. And this was crucial for the 50s and 60s, because it led to the rise of the Singapore Malay film industry. The formation of Category Studio in 53 and Shaw Brothers led to the emphasis in producing films that contain historical tales, especially those involving the Pendekar or warrior. And a lot of these early Malay actors, I found, have to learn Silat from this men of martial skills found throughout Singapore. So they were indeed, very crucial to the development of the early movie industry in Singapore. And this picture to your right here shows, yes, bangsawan was one of the ways for which men of martial skills continued to act out and even preserve their skills. This is something which I will interrogate a bit more in the book, all right? Now, one thing that I also found out is that, for many founders of the early Silat groups in Singapore, they knew that they are living in a foreign land, and they needed to do something to preserve memory, culture, identity of the homeland. Now, this was easy to do in the villages where there is a concentration of people from the same region or area, all right? And Silat teachers became natural leaders and natural religious leaders even to teach the language of the homeland. Very easy for the first generation migrants to do this. But it wasn't easy for members of the Silat groups once they reached the third or fourth generation, because they were faced with a very different challenge in the 60s and 70s. And one of the most primary challenge came from the state itself, the birth of the modern Singapore state. Now, this was where I see a lot of disciplining of Malay martial art groups happening in the 60s and 70s. And according to a lot of these families, it was a very painful process, because many villages and traditional training grounds were destroyed, and they had to register. Now, why is this painful? Because, a lot of these groups are very small. They could not afford the registration fees, and they were forced to create school names, which some of them don't like, because to them, it's not necessary to create a school name. But for those who do not agree to the new conditions, they went extinct. But for those who agreed to the conditions by the modern state to register yourselves and be a legal entity, they prospered and they survived till today, 29 groups. And this is an example of MAKU, or Martial Arts Control Unit registration card, which exists in Roots SG. Okay, not Silat. The Chinese lady probably teaches something else, not Silat. So this is something also of interest to other researchers. Now, what happened to Silat groups in the 60s and 70s was that with the birth of the modern state, the state wanted examples to be used to showcase Singapore Malays as something physically and culturally dynamic. And Silat groups are a very useful tool for this, all right? Because what Silat groups practice are very combative martial arts systems, which need a lot of physical and cultural rigor. So this is why this particular group, Silat Seni Gayung Pasak, the subject of a book which I written in 2017, was invited to National Day celebrations in the city in the 70s. And the archival photos really demonstrated that they were very much into projecting Singapore Malay strength in the 60s and 70s through Silat as a cultural practice. But it is very intriguing to note that today, many young Singapore Malays are now seeking to reconnect to their cultural origins, all right? In the 60s and 70s, doing Silat was a means to reconnect to the homeland. But today, for young Malays, it is done to reconnect to an alternative identity, all right? A lot of young Malays now are thinking deeper about their Bugis, Bawean, Javanese, Sumatran, Sundanese, Maduris cultural identities. And Silat practice right now is seen much more by young Silat teachers as an antidote, a panacea to Singapore Malay problems such as divorce, drugs, economic, and educational underperformance. But this is the result of when Silat groups were disciplined and Silat practice was appropriated by the state as a symbol of Singapore Malay progress, all right? And here I conclude the very short way. And you can see that, this is a very much neglected area, and there is a lot to be done with further work with such groups, and already many things that can be seen as useful to understand Singapore Malay community historical development a bit better. And the most important aspect of this research angle is this. All right, it really gives us clues to how modern Singapore Malay identity was developed. And this aspect of the Singapore Malay modern Malay identity began when Silat groups in Singapore were disciplined. Okay, so I end this presentation and I hit for the Q&A. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Effendy. And again, once again, I should also, thank the two, Guo-Quan and Effendy, for really keeping to time. I know they had to rush here and there a bit, okay, but they did very, very well with that. Yeah. As you can see, with the two papers together, it sort of offer glimpses, into an earlier period. Yeah, in Southeast Asia, to the movement of people, their thoughts, their values, their practices, and the sort of changes, the sort of processes, the kind of new configurations that arose, whether it's in terms, of these divorce practices, or here with the last paper with martial arts, and the role, they play. Okay, and of course, the sort of changing times and historical realities, sort of complicate the story somewhat. Okay, so to hear further, I'm sure you have lots of questions, right? Please, I'm going to open the Q&A session right now. You may do it two ways. You can actually, put in your questions in the chat, and then I would, therefore invite you to speak, or else you just raise your hands. Okay, right. So, in fact, I don't have a question yet. Yeah. So, any questions? Anyone?
I have a question for Effendy, if nobody in the audience wants to ask.
Great.
Yeah, thanks for that fascinating talk, Effendy. And I follow Singapore Malayan history, so it provoked many questions in my mind hearing your presentation. The first is the Tumenggung, right? He's known to be like to the British as a troublemaker, but if there's anyone who has some agency and control of sort of violence, that's him. And it's the British call it piracy, but it's very sea-based. So I wonder, like, how much of that involves, competency of, with fighting on waters, right? And to what extent did the Temenggung, you said he had the war oath, he introduced that. The literature, if I recall correctly, points to the Orang Laut, right? But to what extent did he have a Bugis sort of like fighting force? That's one. The second one is this concept of the martial races in imperialism, and the British coming from India brought their Indian sort of army, but we also can't forget that there were the Malay regiments, right? So to what extent did was there some continuity, right? Especially if I don't really know that history, but if it was sponsored with the approval of the Malay kings, the Malay sultans on the peninsula, right? So was there some continuity there, right? In the formation of a modern Malay fighting force, so to speak. Yeah.
That's two questions. Okay, good. Let me engage you the first one. What we've found so far was that the Temenggung was indeed successful because he managed to pacify piratical activities. That was what we know, right? But what the interviews with the Silat families have also revealed that the Temenggung had the aid and help of Bugis, how do I say this, migrants that came over Sulawesi to the Riau Lingga area in the 19th century. All right, and among them was a very powerful Lord of the Sea, which was very much capable at fighting on land and sea. All right, and the descendants are in Juho. And we do not know whether this is a Sule Watang or not, but I highly suspect that it is, because only a Sule Watang would have the authority, skill, and training to deal with these kinds of activities, such as pacifying pirate activities for the Temenggung. All right, research is still ongoing, but already arriving at very interesting conclusions. And what we found so far about the Temenggung was that he is indeed also a Bugis descent. Sultan Hussein also was a Bugis descent as well. So we have here, two Malay rulers with Bugis, lineages, and they are also aided by Bugis migrants who came to them and offered their services. And this is what the British recorded in the archives. All right, strange Bugis people suddenly living at the Temenggung's area at the Teluk Blangah over there. All right, huge compounds filled with Bugis migrants, and we still do not know who they are and what they are capable of. But what we do know is that in the Pahang Civil War, the Temenggung did send Sri Latang to fight on his behalf in that war. And this is something very intriguing. The second question is that, okay, now this is a very interesting question because the answers are very difficult, to be very honest with you. It would seem that, there is no direct continuity of the pre-colonial martial ethic or activities to the Malay regiment. All right, the British were quite adamant that the Malays do not fight like in the past. They had to be modern day soldiers, which is regimentation, discipline, and following orders. All right, this is the essence of training. Now, to answer that subconscious question that you have in your mind, why did Lieutenant Adnan fight to the death at Opium Hill there? Was it really due to the Malay martial ethic? I don't think so. It is really due to the training that she received from the British, all right, to stand your post and fight as you are ordered to do. Whether or not this is a Malay martial ethic, I don't know. All right, so, but to answer the second question directly, I don't think there's any connection to the Malay pre-colonial Malay martial ethic to the Malay regiment forces in the colonial period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Was Adnan a Bugis? Do you know?
Sumatran.
Sumatran.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. Open to the floor again. Any other questions?
I don't know. If not, may I?
Sure.
Sure.
I don't know if Count Trocky, I can't recall if he talks about this, but the significance of the Temenggung having, this power would be how he got the Kangchus to pay tax to him. So it's very hard to imagine not having some administration of violence at his disposal to have that Kangchu system.
That's right. That was the ethic or mentality of Tamu Abdul Rahman. But his son, Tamu Ibrahim, had very different ideas.
Okay.
Right? Tamu Abdul Rahman descendants were cultivated. Maybe they grew up with this understanding that, you know, to be like a modern ruler will be very much to their advantage. Now, this contrasts with Sultan Hussein's descendant, who stuck to the old ways. This is what I found about Sultan Hussein and his son, right? And his grandson, Sultan Hussein, followed by his son, Sultan Hussein, then Sultan Ali, then the other one is called, my God, I forgot his name is. Okay, but anyway, they stuck to the old ways. And this caused them a lot of problems, because for them to gain some sort of legitimacy in their minds was to stick to this ancient idea of, you know, ta'atan. I mean, ta'at, being loyal to your followers, to have a pre-colonial-like relationship with your members of your court, all right? Sultan Hussein's court, we still do not know the composition of it, but it has to follow the Malacca structure, all right, which is consisted of Orang Laut, the Batin, the Temenggung, Bendahara, Bendahari, all right? This is the system which is followed by most of the kerajaan in the Malay states, but we still do not know what is the role of the Sulewatang in Sultan Hussein's court, or was there a Sulewatang in Sultan Hussein's court? Because the absence of a Sulewatang in Sultan Hussein's court would tell many things about the legitimacy of this ruler, isn't it?
But it replaced the Laksmana, yeah?
This is
right?
where I need to do a little bit more research. It is interchangeable.
I'm surprised you didn't mention Laksmana as sort of like constitutive of the Malay court. Right?
That's right. Yeah. We still do not know whether the Sulewatang is a Laksmana, because remember that this is a Bugis diasporic community in Southeast Asia. Perhaps, you know, the Bugis have assimilated into Malay culture, and they use Malay titles interchangeably with Bugis ones. I think that likely happened. So the Bugis could be using Sulewatang, but at the same time meaning Laksmana as well.
Cool, exciting.
Yeah, man.
Looking forward to more.
I have a question for Seng. Guo-Quan.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome? Okay, about this divorce thing. Is there intermarriages between the Chinese women and Javanese nobility? Because that would lead, this would lead to a very different response and divorce proceedings. You know.
That's very interesting, and there are known cases of, you know, the merchants, right? The wealthy merchants exchanging daughters in the same way, right? So actually gifting a daughter to I think in Jogja, there's a very famous case. Before the 19th century, the Chinese were engaged by these sultans as there's a very famous case in Cirebon, right? As tax collectors,
yes,
and whatnot, right? They then rose up the local indigenous royal hierarchy, and they incorporated that way. But it's in the 19th century, probably the last known case would be 1810s, 1820s, right? But the Chinese capitans stopped assimilating, right, towards the native state, because, you know, the Dutch had set up this civil law system, divide and rule. Yeah.
That's absolutely fascinating. It stopped assimilating. That's a key thing, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
We had a nice research seminar between the three of us.
Yeah, it's raining now, so I guess.
I know. Yeah, that's the thing when you're the last session, everyone's like tired out. Yeah,
it's a Friday.
Oh yes, it's a Friday. Yes, I know.
We still have 30 people who stuck with us again, you know.
Yeah. Actually, we have only 5 minutes to go. So, you know, if you have a question, you've got like 5 minutes, you know, to pop in your question. Yeah.
Yeah, Effendy, I have a question.
Sure.
If I may, and I know your research, at least what you presented, was really on the Bugis diaspora.
Mhm.
But I recall that there was, at least for a period of time, within the sort of Johor court, some contest between the Minangkabau faction and the Bugis faction. And I just wondered, in your research,
Mhm.
whether there was any evidence of that, or by the time we get to the period you're talking about, that sort of contest had disappeared and become something else.
Thank you for that great question. The Minangkabau faction that you mentioned presented itself during Raja Siak's attempt to grab the Johor throne. All right, he depended on the Minangkabau fighters. All right, and this is something very interesting because based on an interview that I had with a Minangkabau Silat family in Singapore, all right, their style is antithetical to the Bugis style. All right. Once they say that, it gives me a very good idea about how these enmities would have developed out of this Bugis and Minang. All right. These are disparate styles, both exceptionally violent, but they saw themselves as rivals. It is not surprising to me that Raja Siap got Minangkabau fighters to help him because they were the enemies of the Bugis. Not surprising to me at all. But this is the 17th century. 19th century, however, we see Johor being opened up in terms of the rubber plantations, tin mines, and we have the entrance of many third-world migrants. Now, interestingly enough, I found that the Sumatran Malays had a lot to do with the disruption of Bugis commercial and military activity in Johor in the 19th century. They were the ones that really helped the Mua headman to really repel any sort of Bugis influence in the 19th century in Johor itself. Again, this is at the beginnings of the research, but I see that one of the primary reasons why the Bugis declined in the 19th and 20th century was the Sumatran backlash, which they faced. Somehow the Temunggung of Mua got help from the Malays from Sumatra to repel the historical enemy, which are the Bugis, which are seen as parasitical people. Huh? Right, so that's
very, very interesting.
yeah, I just found out from this. So
it really carried on from 17th century even into 19th century.
Well, that rivalries are deep and hatred is long. Yep. Even till today, these groups as well have exceptionally violent enmities. It's very difficult to talk to them, to be as neutral as possible.
Thank you.
What a note. What's something to remember? We have a question from Timothy Pugh. Timothy, would you like to?
Okay.
Well, it's basically the question of whether the Sultan of Johor's battalion, his army, does it have any Silat heritage to speak of? So that means, would that be a more appropriate place to look rather than Askar Melayu, which is British?
That's a great question. I do not know how to answer this, but I remember that the Sultan of Juho in the Germanta War, this was a very violent period for which the grandson of Sultan Hussein engaged in a violent attempt to get back the Mua Kesang area, which he thought as his heritage. Now, this is something very interesting because the Sultan of Johor, he became Sultan after the 1855 treaty, and what the Sultan of Johor brought forth was his traditional armies to engage the fighters of Sultan Hussein's grandson. And this is something very interesting because in the report of conflict of this engagement that this Sultan of Johor's soldier had of how he engaged with this army was that traditional warfare was used as well as modern techniques as well. So I do not know whether this is Silat heritage or not, but it is very clear to me that by the late 19th century, if the Sultan of Johor had a military force, which he had, of course, they had already been fundamentally modernized to fight in a modern way, not traditional anymore.
Okay, thanks, Timothy. Thanks for your questions and Effendy for answering that. Now, the time now is 3:45, which means it's time for me to hand over the session, for closing remarks. First, once again, let me thank the two panelists, for their very interesting and insightful presentations. And now, could I, invite Elmi Nikma to have the closing session. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, everyone. It was indeed very exciting, especially when Effendy was talking about Silat and how I was once also very much into Silat and, being part of. Now, after the discussion, very, very deep, much deeper understanding of the heritage and the history behind Silat and how it's actually a very much socio-political and very, very rich, deep historical heritage, not coming from Singapore itself, but also from other regions, a lot borrowed from other regions. Well, so I'm here to provide the closing remarks. So I'm given basically 10 minutes, but I do not want to hold or take the whole 10 minutes. I think between 5 to 10 minutes is good. So again, thank you so much for coming and sitting through to the end of the Singapore Research Nexus virtual event. So this is actually our flagship event, right? So for in this particular day or today, we've had 3 very interesting panels, just to wrap them up, right? The panel number 1 spoke about spoke about language and multiculturalism. It explored very interestingly how culture and language actually evolved in the socio-political landscape of Singapore by venturing into the studies of hawker centers, Baba Malay, and even children's socio-linguistic development, basically language, right? So a lot of these insights or tools, if I may, are being used or focused on to actually have a deeper understanding of the language and multiculturalism growth in Singapore, or the changes and transformations in Singapore. So in panel 2, we have a very interesting and deep discussion that expands a little bit more out of Singapore and into the region, looking at religion and place. And last but not least is the last panel with 2 very, very exciting speakers who kind of engage themselves more than anything else, and find each other quite motivating. The topic quite motivating for one another. Is on diaspora and cosmopolitanism, right? So I do not need to go into summary. I think most of us have sat through and listened to all the talks. So what I would like to share from all of you is that this is by no means the first Singapore Research Nexus event. If for those who have just joined us for this particular event, in fact, this is actually the 11th event. Started in 2012, right? So this is basically there have been more than 10 of such workshops being conducted in Singapore or in NUS actually. So just to let you all know, this is a very mature workshop. This is a very established kind of workshop, and we look to have more and more of such workshop. So our next workshop on a 3-panel workshop will occur in the second half of this year, basically in the fall semester or in semester 1 in AY 22 and 23. So we hope all of you still continue to attend, and for all the speakers who have already presented, feel free to actually engage to further your studies and to further engage, further participate in this talk, right? Okay, so the next thing that I would like to share in closing remarks is that apart from the rich discussion, the thoughts and the ideas that come up from the discussion sessions themselves, the aim of this Singapore Research Nexus workshop is actually to facilitate collaborations and spur research among faculty as well as policymakers. We also have quite a bit of policymaker from the ministries in our audiences. So in fact, right, when I see through some of the discussions and some of the presentations, I'm left with more questions in my head. Like, for example, Associate Professor Lurista actually spoke and went really in depth and really gave a very good account of how language has transformed between local and non-local children in Singapore schools, between expat children and local children in Singapore schools. So the question that comes up to my mind is, how then do these transformations play themselves out online, right? In social media or in computer-mediated communication? Do computer mediation or online forms of language communication actually affect, locals' ability or locals' way of speaking languages or speaking English, and so forth, right? So basically, I'm sure, apart from myself, most, if not all of you, have more questions coming out from the sessions. So we encourage all of you to get in touch with the speakers themselves. So please do, to actually foster and move these new friendships or this new intellectual discovery forward with the speakers. And if you do not have, or if you have more ideas or new thoughts and ideas on what is relevant to Singapore's research, and having a good idea of what, the kind of topics that the SRN, Singapore Research Nexus in FASS, has organized or is organizing, and you want to get more involved and you want to participate more in it, or if you want the FASS as SRN to facilitate these collaborations, do not hesitate to get in touch with us, right? So basically, the email, I think, is in the chat. Rachel has kindly shared it in the chat. So please, Heiko has kindly shared it in the chat. So please go to the SRN website, our Facebook page, as well as our email address at nexus@nus.edu.sg. And we really look forward to getting more ideas, getting more involvement, or even any kind of query, right? If you want us to link you up to any of the speakers or any of the chairpersons that have actually organized or that have actually managed and discussed in the different sessions. All right. So last but not least, of course, the customary of who's who and who actually, the people behind the scenes that made this happen. A big round of applause to the organizing team, led by Rachel, Yok Chuan, Heiko, and Ariel, right? So they worked hard day and night over the December holidays, even before that, to actually plan for this Singapore Research Nexus. So if you feel that they have done and you are in support of them, so please look out for our next session, our next few events for the Singapore Research Nexus. All right, so the next few events coming up are, we have a series of book launches and forums, or book forums planned, right? So the next one will be, the next book launch will be in May. So please put that in your schedule. It will be at the Port. The Port is basically an event space in the National Library Board, or at the NLB. And it will be a book launch titled Opposing Power, Building Opposition Alliances in Electoral Autocracies by Dr. Alvin Ong from Political Science. Following that, we have another online book launch. And also in August, we'll have another book forum at the same place in the National Library Board, right? So on top of these book events all lined up, we'll also have, as I mentioned earlier, another 3-panel event similar to today's event planned for the fall semester, right? So please stay tuned, please keep in touch and find out more, and feel free and keep updated to all the events that we are organizing moving forward. So that's all that I have to say. So again, thank you very much for all of those that have actually stayed on, and I hope all of us enjoyed the Singapore Research Nexus for today. Okay, bye-bye everyone, and have a good weekend, and Happy New Year.